The dress she'd saved 3 months to buy was still pressed. Her hands were still shaking from the train ride. And the man she'd crossed half the country to marry was standing 30 feet away in the middle of Caldwell's main street, holding another woman's hand, wearing a wedding ring that hadn't existed in any of his letters, smiling at Vivian Holloway like she was the funniest thing he'd seen all year. The whole town was watching, and not one of them had the decency to warn her. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the end, and drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train from Cheyenne was 40 minutes late, which meant Vivian Holloway spent 40 minutes standing in the narrow corridor between cars, watching Wyoming roll past the window and rehearsing the conversation she would have with Thomas Greer when she finally stepped onto the platform. She'd been rehearsing it for 800 miles. Not because she was nervous exactly. She was 26 years old. She'd kept the books for 3 separate businesses back in Missouri, and she had crossed worse distances for smaller reasons. But Thomas's letters had a particular quality. Warm in places, oddly formal in others, like a man who knew what sentiment was supposed to sound like without quite feeling it. And somewhere around the Kansas border, she'd started to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. She told herself that was just nerves. She told herself it every time the doubt surfaced. The train lurched to a stop. Steam hissed up past the windows. Outside, a hand-painted sign read Caldwell, W-Y, in letters that had been weathered nearly to nothing. Vivian picked up her traveling bag. One large trunk had been checked through and would arrive separately, straightened the collar of her dress, and walked to the exit. The platform was crowded for a Tuesday. Families waited for parcels. A group of men leaned against the depot wall, talking and not really watching anything in particular, the way men do when they're waiting for something interesting to happen. A woman in a yellow dress stood near the edge of the platform holding a bundle of dried flowers. Vivian stepped down and looked for Thomas. She spotted him immediately. He was hard to miss, but tall, dark-haired, with the kind of posture that announced itself. He was standing on the far side of the street, not on the platform, not where someone would stand if they were waiting for an arriving passenger. He was standing beside the woman in the yellow dress. Vivian understood before her mind had caught up to what her eyes were seeing. It was the way his hand was resting at the small of the other woman's back. Easy, proprietary, completely at home. The way the woman leaned slightly into his shoulder. The plain gold band on her left hand. The plain gold band on his left hand. Vivian stood very still on the platform while the rest of the passengers moved around her, and the luggage handlers called out numbers, and somewhere a child was crying because it had dropped something. She looked at the ring on Thomas Greer's finger. She looked at the ring on the woman's finger. She looked at Thomas Greer's face, and he was looking back at her now, and he was smiling, not the smile of a guilty man, not the flinching, horrified expression of someone caught in a terrible mistake. It was an easy smile, almost amused, like he'd been expecting her to arrive and had already decided he found the whole situation entertaining. "Vivienne," he called across the street. His voice carried. The men against the depot wall stopped talking. "You made it. You're a little late." She walked toward him because there was nothing else to do. Her feet carried her across the street while her mind was still somewhere back on the train, still rehearsing a conversation that was never going to happen. Up close, Thomas Greer looked exactly like his photograph. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, that particular handsomeness that knows itself. The woman beside him was younger than Vivian had expected, with a round, pretty face and an expression that was working very hard at something between sympathy and discomfort. "Thomas," Vivian said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is this?" "This is Margaret." He said it pleasantly. "My wife. We were married this morning." Somewhere to her left, one of the men against the depot wall let out a low whistle. Someone else laughed, a short, involuntary sound, quickly suppressed. Vivian looked at Margaret, who was now looking at the ground. "This morning," Vivian repeated. "I meant to write," Thomas said, not particularly convincingly. Things moved quickly. "You meant to write?" She stared at him. "I have 43 letters from you, Thomas. 43. The last one arrived 2 weeks ago. You were asking me what color I preferred for curtains." "Well," he shrugged. One shoulder, barely an inch, the gesture of a man who had run the calculation and come out on the comfortable side. Plans change. The crowd had thickened now. People drifting from storefronts, from the far end of the platform, finding excuses to be somewhere near this particular stretch of street. Vivian was aware of them the way you're aware of cold water rising, not all at once, but steadily. A woman near the mercantile said something to her companion that Vivian couldn't make out, and both of them laughed. "She actually came," somebody murmured. Not quietly enough. Vivian turned her head slowly. There was a group of women under the awning of the dry goods store, and their expressions told her everything. The particular shading of amusement mixed with pity, the way people look when they've been waiting for the punchline and it's finally arrived. They knew. Some or all of them. They had known this would happen today, and they had watched her walk off that train and cross the street, and they had let her. The humiliation arrived in a wave, and it was worse than anything Thomas had done because it was multiplied by every face watching her absorb it. "Did everyone know?" she asked. She wasn't sure who she was asking. No one answered directly. A few people looked away. Thomas was watching her with that expression still on his face, that mild, entertained patience, like a man watching a dog try to get through a closed gate. "You know," he said, conversationally, as if the crowd weren't there, "I was honestly a little surprised you came at all. I thought someone would have told you by now." "Why would anyone tell me?" Vivian said. "I don't know a single person in this town." "No," he agreed. "That's rather the point." She understood it then. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way cold truth tends to arrive. He had chosen her specifically because she was alone, because she was 800 miles from anyone who knew her, because if she arrived to find this situation, she would have no allies, no resources, no options except retreat or absorption. She was supposed to be humiliated and leave, or humiliated and stay and accept whatever scraps he offered. Either way, she was supposed to be manageable. "Well," she said. She was surprised by how level her voice was. "This has been clarifying." Thomas laughed at that. It was a real laugh, not unkind exactly, just completely indifferent to how it landed. "Look on the bright side," he said. "You've had a chance to see Wyoming. It's beautiful country." Someone in the crowd laughed openly at that. The wave of amusement rippled through them, and Vivian stood in the middle of it, still holding her traveling bag, still wearing the dress she'd pressed the morning she left Missouri, and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. 800 miles from home, no return ticket purchased, $34 in her purse, a trunk arriving separately with everything she'd thought she'd need for a new life. She had nowhere to go. She was deciding whether her legs would hold her steady if she turned and walked, and where she would walk to, when a voice came from across the street. "That's enough." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the quality of it, flat, unhurried, carrying a kind of weight that didn't come from volume, that made the crowd go quieter almost involuntarily. A man was crossing the street toward them, not hurrying. He moved like someone who had decided something and was now simply carrying it out, the way you carry out tasks that aren't optional. He was somewhere around 30, weathered in the way that outdoor work weathers people, but not old, just exposed. His hat was dusty. His coat had seen better winters. He was not, in any visible way, a remarkable man. But something about him made the crowd pull back slightly as he passed through it. He stopped about 6 feet from Thomas Greer and looked at him with an expression that Vivian could only describe as thorough contempt. Not hot, not dramatic, just steady, like the opinion had been formed a long time ago and was merely being confirmed. "You are," the man said quietly to Thomas, "a small and pitiful human being." Thomas blinked. "I beg your pardon? She rode 800 miles because you spent 6 months lying to her." The man didn't raise his voice. "You knew this morning what you were going to do. You let her get off that train anyway. You let these people watch." He glanced at the crowd briefly. Not long, just enough, and then looked back at Thomas. "And you're standing there grinning about it." "This is a private matter," Thomas said, and his voice had lost some of its ease. "You made it public the second you let the whole street gather to watch." The man turned away from Thomas like he'd already lost interest, which was perhaps the most cutting thing he could have done, and looked at Vivian. Up close, his eyes were a pale, grayish green. He He had the look of a man who is accustomed to assessing things quickly, livestock, fences, weather, situations, and had already completed his assessment of this one. "I'm Graham Ashcroft," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 12 miles north of town. I need someone who can manage accounts. The pay is fair and the work is honest." A pause. "I understand if you'd rather not make a decision in the middle of the street." Vivian looked at him. She looked at the crowd, all those faces that had watched her walk into this and said nothing. She looked at Thomas Greer, who was watching this development with less amusement now and something more like the beginning of irritation. She looked back at Graham Ashcroft, who was waiting with a patience that seemed genuine rather than performed, the patience of someone who had asked a reasonable question and was prepared for either answer. "What is the work involved?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprised, but close. "Ledgers, mostly. Accounts receivable and payable. I've been managing them myself, and I'm not good at it." "Livestock operation?" "Cattle, primarily. Some horses." "Do you have the last 3 years of records?" 2.5. There's a gap." "I can work with 2.5. She shifted her traveling bag to her other hand. "I'll need a place to stay. There's a room in the main house. Used to be a storage room, but it has a window." "Is it private?" "Got a door with a lock." Vivian nodded once. She turned to look at Thomas Greer one last time, not with anger, not with tears, just the kind of look you give a place you've decided to leave permanently. "The curtains," she said to him, "were going to be blue." Then she turned and walked beside Graham Ashcroft, away from the depot and away from the laughing crowd and away from the life she'd traveled 800 miles to start. She didn't look back. The wagon that Graham Ashcroft drove was not comfortable. The bench seat had a crack down the middle, and the road north of Caldwell consisted largely of suggestions where a road might someday be. Vivian held her traveling bag in her lap and braced herself against the side of the bench and watched Wyoming go past. It was, she admitted silently, beautiful country. Thomas hadn't been wrong about that, which was deeply irritating. Graham drove without much conversation, which she appreciated. She was not in a condition for conversation. She was in the condition of someone who has just had a large portion of their immediate future collapse and is now quietly assessing what remains. What remained? $34. A trunk that would arrive at the Caldwell Depot in 3 days. The clothes she was wearing. 8 years of bookkeeping experience, starting at 14 when her father's lumber business had gotten too complicated for the one ledger he'd been keeping. 3 years managing accounts for a hotel in St. Louis. 2 years after that working for a freight company until it went under. She was good at numbers. She was, she knew, without vanity, genuinely good. Not just accurate, but intuitive, able to see patterns in columns of figures the way some people can read meaning in a face. It was the one thing she'd always been certain of. "You don't have to say anything about what happened back there," she said after a while. Graham kept his eyes on the road. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." Another quarter-mile of silence. And Hawk wheeled above a rise to the east, circled twice, dropped out of sight. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 7 years. Bought it from the estate of a man named Colbert, who died without heirs." He paused. "It was in worse condition than I was led to believe." "That seems to be a pattern for people coming to Wyoming." He glanced at her sideways. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. "It does seem that way." "How large is the operation?" 300 head of cattle currently. Was closer to 450 2 years ago. "What happened to the other 150? He was quiet for a moment. "That's part of what I'm hoping you can help me figure out." Vivian looked at him. "You don't know where your cattle went?" "I know where they went. I sold them. What I can't make sense of is why the returns on those sales are so much lower than they should be. I've checked my own figures 6 times and I keep getting different answers." He said this without embarrassment, which she appreciated. "Numbers aren't my strength. That's honest. I found it's better to know what you're not good at." They rode on. The land opened up around them, wide grass plains rolling toward distant ridges, the sky enormous and cloud-stacked in the west. Every so often, a line of cottonwoods marked where water ran, the leaves turning at the edges with the first suggestion of autumn. The ranch appeared gradually. First a fence line, then a windmill, then the low shape of outbuildings against the horizon. As they got closer, Vivian could see the main house was solid. 2 stories, well-built timber, with a porch that ran the length of the front. Though it had the look of a place maintained by someone who kept things functional without being particularly interested in anything beyond functional. Several men were working near the barn. They looked up as the wagon came in, and Vivian was aware of their curiosity, the quick assessment of a new face, the questions they were keeping polite enough not to ask out loud. Graham stopped the wagon near the porch steps. "I'll introduce you to the hands tomorrow, if that's acceptable. Tonight you can get settled." "That's fine." He climbed down and went to take her bag from her before she'd quite registered he was doing it. It wasn't gallant, exactly. It was more like he'd done a quick calculation about the most efficient way to handle the situation and was carrying it out. She let him take the bag and climbed down herself. The inside of the house was cleaner than she'd expected and less decorated than any home she'd been in for years. The main room had a table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a shelf of books that surprised her. There were more than she would have guessed. The kitchen was through a door to the left. A staircase ran up the right wall. "Kitchen's there, outhouse is behind the barn. There's a well pump at the back corner of the house." Graham set her bag down at the bottom of the stairs. "Room's the second door on the right. I'll bring water up so you can wash." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He said it straightforwardly. "Supper's in an hour if you're hungry. If you're not, there's no obligation." He went back outside. Vivian stood alone in the main room of a stranger's house in Wyoming and let out a slow breath. She was alive. She had a room. She had work. She climbed the stairs. Bata. The room had been a storage room, as advertised, and it still smelled faintly of cedar and old rope. But it was clean, swept and aired, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that faced east toward where the morning light would come in. Someone had put a hook on the back of the door and a small braided rug on the floor that looked like it had been brought from somewhere else specifically for this room. Graham had done that, she realized. Not recently. The rug was well worn, but at some point he had prepared for this room to be used by someone. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be tired for a moment. Not broken. She was not broken. She had specifically decided she was not going to be broken by Thomas Greer, but tired. The tiredness of 800 miles and 43 letters and the specific exhaustion of humiliation. She thought about this crowd on that street, all those faces, the way the woman at the mercantile had laughed. She thought about Graham Ashcroft walking across the street, the way the crowd had moved for him, not because he was threatening anyone, but because there was something in his bearing that made people instinctively get out of his way when he decided where he was going. She rode 800 miles because you spent 6 months lying to her. He'd said it like it was a simple fact, which it was. But most people, in her experience, preferred to dress facts like that up in more comfortable clothes. A knock at the door. She opened it to find Graham holding a pitcher of water. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. He stood with his back half turned, like he'd thought of something he wasn't sure he was going to say. "For what it's worth," he said, still not fully looking at her, "I've known Thomas Greer for 2 years. I knew from the beginning he was the kind of man who makes promises he has no intention of keeping." A pause. "I should have found a way to get word to you. I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." Vivian looked at the back of his head. "Did you know he was writing to me? I knew he was courting someone back east. I didn't know the details until about 3 weeks ago." He finally turned enough to meet her eyes. "I found out who you were, and I told myself someone closer to the situation would take care of it." His jaw tightened slightly. That was cowardly reasoning. She considered this. "It was," she agreed. He nodded, like he'd expected that. "Supper's in 40 minutes. He left. She closed the door. She poured water into the basin on the washstand and washed her face and hands and the back of her neck, and stood there looking at herself in the small mirror above it. Her face looked the same as it had this morning, which seemed surprising. She'd half expected the humiliation to leave a visible mark. She dried her hands and went to her traveling bag and took out the small leather notebook she used to track everything. Expenses, ideas, things to remember, and opened it to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "What I know." Then she started making a list. What? She came down to supper. The kitchen table seated 4. Graham was already at it, along with two of the ranch hands he introduced as Clem Baxter and Dolph Riddle, both older, both weathered to approximately the same degree, both possessed of the quiet wariness of men who didn't know yet whether a new person was going to be trouble. There was also a boy, maybe 17, sitting at the far end of the table. He had the angular look of someone who'd grown fast and hadn't finished filling out yet, with dark circles under his eyes, and the habit of watching the door even when he was looking at his plate. "Jonah Pike," Graham said, "youngest of my hands. Been with me 2 years." Jonah nodded without making eye contact. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and it was better than Vivian had expected, which she said. "Dolph cooks," Graham said. "Clem washes up." "That was decided through a process I don't fully understand," Clem said. "I won the agreement fair," Dolph said, without heat, like they'd had this conversation many times. The meal settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who'd been eating together long enough to not need to perform. Vivian sat and ate and listened. She was good at listening. It was part of what made her good at her work. The way people talked around a table told you more about a situation than any ledger. What she observed, Clem and Dolph were easy with each other, and moderately easy with Graham, in the way of men who respected someone without worrying about whether he liked them. Graham spoke little but directly, and both older men answered him the same way. Nobody performed for the new person at the table. Jonah said almost nothing. He ate quickly and kept watching the door. After supper, when the other hands had gone out to finish evening chores, Graham showed Vivian the study off the main room, where a desk sat under a window with a lamp on it and an alarming quantity of papers stacked in no apparent order. "The ledgers are in the cabinet," he said, gesturing. "Or most of them are. Some things got misfiled. I've been keeping track of what I can find." Vivian looked at the desk. Then she looked at the cabinet. Then she looked at Graham. "How long has it been like this?" she asked carefully. "About 3 years?" She pressed her lips together. "I told you I wasn't good at it," he said. "You said numbers weren't your strength. You didn't say anything about organizational systems." "That too." She looked at the stacks again. Under different circumstances, this would have been overwhelming. Right now, it was almost a relief. Here was a problem she knew exactly how to approach. Here was something that made sense. "I'll need a week to sort through this before I can give you any real picture," she said. "Maybe 10 days. Take what you need. I want to ask you questions as I go, about specific transactions, specific dates. I'll answer what I can." She nodded. "Tomorrow morning, then." He turned to leave. "Mr. Ashcroft." He paused. "Why did you offer me work?" she asked. "You've known for 3 weeks who I was. You could have come to me then." He thought about that for a moment. Not evasively. He seemed to actually be considering the honest answer. "I needed someone who could read accounts," he said. "I'd been putting off finding someone because I didn't like the idea of a stranger in my records." He stopped. And today, standing there watching what Greer was doing, it seemed like the moment to stop putting it off. "That's practical." "I suppose it is." "Not charitable." "I didn't say it was." He met her eyes steadily. "I won't pretend I offered you work purely out of kindness, but I won't pretend the other thing wasn't part of it either." Vivian nodded slowly. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 6 months. "Good night, Mr. Ashcroft." "Good night, Miss Holloway." She was up before the sun the next morning. The house was quiet. Outside, the first birds were doing whatever birds do in that narrow gap between night and morning that isn't quite either. She dressed and came downstairs and found the kitchen fire already banked from the night, coaxed it back up, and put water on. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open for 20 minutes before she heard boots on the stairs. Graham came down, stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and didn't say anything for a moment. "There's coffee on," she said. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her. She kept writing. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the gray beginning of the day. "You don't have to start today," he said. "I want to." Another silence. She finished what she was writing and capped her pen. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she said, "about knowing Thomas Greer for 2 years. Graham looked at her. "What does he do exactly? For work?" "He brokers land deals, connects buyers with sellers, takes a commission." Graham paused. "He works for Silas Crow." The name meant nothing to her yet. Who's Silas Crow? A man who owns a great deal of property in this territory and keeps acquiring more. Graham said it neutrally, but something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. A very successful businessman. You don't say that like it's a compliment. It isn't meant as one. He wrapped both hands around his mug. There's a pattern in this territory, Miss Holloway. Ranches start struggling. Bad year, bad luck, doesn't matter. Then a broker shows up with an offer. Seems fair at the time. 6 months later, Crow owns the land and the family is somewhere else. He was quiet. I've watched it happen to 4 operations in the past 3 years. Vivian looked at her notebook, then at the door to the study. 3 years, the same time frame as the missing clarity in the accounts, the same window as the unexplained drop in cattle numbers. The accounts I'll be looking at, she said slowly. The missing records, the drops in your sale returns. Graham's jaw was very still. I'll start this morning, she said. She got up, refilled his coffee without asking, poured herself a cup, and went into the study. The lamp was already burning by the time the sun came up properly. She didn't notice. She was already reading. Well, what she found in the first 3 hours was a mess. What she found in the 3 hours after that was something else entirely. It started with a simple observation. The numbers in the livestock sale records didn't match the numbers in the deposit records. Not by a lot. By small amounts, individually, the kind of discrepancy you'd chalk up to a recording error. But they were consistent. Every single sale, going back almost 3 years, came in low. Not the same amount low. Not randomly low. Low in a pattern. Vivian had grown up watching her father's lumber business. She'd learned at 14 that there were 2 ways numbers could be wrong. Accidentally wrong, which tended to be random, and deliberately wrong, which tended to have a shape. These had a shape. She found the first clear instance at 11 in the morning, buried in a sale from 18 months prior. A cattle sale to a buyer listed as TR Holdings for a price that was $12 below what the current market rate would support. Not impossible. Prices fluctuated, quality varied, but the name TR Holdings appeared again 2 months later, and again 4 months after that, always just below market, always with a slightly different representative listed as the contact. She sat back and stared at the ceiling. Then she started pulling every ledger she could find and laying them out in chronological order along the study floor, which was not a short process. Graham appeared in the doorway around noon with a plate of bread and cheese and set it on the edge of the desk without comment. She ate it without looking up from a ledger from 14 months prior that was showing her something she very much didn't want to be seeing. By mid-afternoon, she had a rough map of it. Not complete. There were gaps she couldn't fill yet. But enough. Someone had been systematically draining this ranch. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would raise immediate alarm. A few dollars here on a cattle sale. A slightly inflated price on a supply purchase. A buyer who appeared on the records but whose details didn't quite add up when you looked closely. Small, careful, consistent erosion of the ranch's financial foundation over roughly 30 months. Vivian set her pen down very deliberately on the desk and looked at what she'd assembled. This was not incompetence. This was not bad luck. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She stood and went to the study door and found Graham in the main room, mending a piece of tack. I need to ask you something, she said. He put the tack down. All right. Who has had access to these records for the past 3 years? Other than you. He was quiet for a long moment. Myself. Clem, when I needed him to check something, and he stopped. Who else? His expression had gone to something careful and flat. Jonah sometimes helped me file things when I got behind. Vivian looked at him steadily. He's been with me 2 years, Graham said. His voice was careful in a way that told her he was aware of what she was implying and did not want to believe it. He came to me with nothing. No family. I gave him work and a place to sleep. I'm not accusing him of anything, she said. I'm asking who had access. He stood up. The mending lay forgotten in his chair. What did you find? She took him into the study and showed him. She walked him through it carefully. The pattern, the buyer name that kept appearing, the cumulative loss when you totaled the discrepancies across 30 months. He stood at her shoulder and looked at the figures and didn't say anything for a long time. How much? He finally asked. She'd calculated it twice to be sure. At minimum, $4,200 over the past 28 months. Possibly more, depending on what's in the records I haven't found yet. She heard his breath go out, slow and controlled, the breath of a man absorbing a blow. That's not all, she said. He looked at her. TR Holdings, she said, the buyer that appears on the records. I can't verify it yet, but I don't think it's a real company. I think it's a shell, a name someone created to route payments through, skimming the difference between what you should have received and what you did. She paused. I've seen this before. Not this exact method, but close enough. Silas Crow, Graham said, very quietly. I don't know that yet, but whoever is doing this knows your operation from the inside. They know which sales to touch and which to leave alone. They know how much they can take without triggering a review. She met his eyes. This wasn't done by someone outside looking in. Graham stood very still for what felt like a long time. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the study, through the main room and out the front door. Vivienne stood among the spread ledgers and listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then nothing. She sat back down at the desk. She picked up her pen, and outside, through the east window, she saw Graham Ashcroft standing in the yard in the late afternoon light, hands at his sides, looking at nothing, looking at something she couldn't see. And he stood there a long time before he moved again. She looked back at the ledgers. There was still a great deal more to find. She kept working. She found the second layer on a Thursday. It was her 5th day in the study, and she had stopped keeping track of meals in any meaningful way. She ate when Graham or Dolph left something on the desk, and she drank coffee until it ran out and then drank water, and mostly she worked. The floor around her chair was covered in papers, organized into a system that would have looked chaotic to anyone else, and was, to her, as readable as a map. The pattern she'd identified in the first 3 hours had held and deepened as she'd moved forward through the records. TR Holdings appeared on 17 separate transactions. The cumulative loss was now closer to $5,000 than 4, and she hadn't finished. But it was the second thread she'd found buried in the supply purchase records that kept her awake the previous 2 nights, the one she'd been pulling carefully for 3 days, that finally came loose on Thursday morning. The feed supplier was listed as Cartwright and Sons out of Laramie. Graham confirmed they were real. He'd dealt with them for years, good prices, reliable delivery. The invoices Vivienne had found matched in terms of vendor name and general format. But when she set 6 months of invoices side by side and compared them against the payment ledger, something was wrong with the invoice numbers. They didn't run sequentially the way printed invoices from a single supplier should. They jumped. They repeated. 2 invoices from different months carried the same number with different amounts. Someone had been creating duplicate invoices and submitting them for payment. It was slower money than the cattle sales manipulation, but steadier. And it required something specific. Whoever was doing it needed to have access to the original invoices to copy their format accurately enough that Graham, reviewing the accounts himself, wouldn't catch the difference. He'd said as much. He checked the figures, not the invoice numbers. Why would he? He trusted his supplier. You'd only notice if you put every invoice in the same room and looked at all of them at once. Vivienne set down her pen and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. 2 methods. Running simultaneously. Coordinated closely enough that the total drain stayed below the threshold that would force a crisis in any given month, while accumulating toward something much larger over time. This was not one person acting alone out of opportunity. This was planned. She heard the front door and then Graham's boots, and she called out before he'd made it past the main room. I need you in here. He appeared in the study doorway. He'd been out since before breakfast doing something with the south fence line. There was mud on his boots and a cut on the back of his left hand that he hadn't bothered to wrap. He looked at her face and didn't say anything, which she was coming to recognize as his way of bracing for something. She showed him the invoices. She laid them out in order and walked him through the numbers the same way she had with the cattle records. Carefully, without editorializing, just the facts in sequence. She'd learned that he absorbed information better when she gave it to him straight rather than building toward a conclusion. He was not a man who appreciated being managed toward an answer. He stood at the desk and looked at the invoices for a long time after she finished explaining. Cartwright's invoices, he said. I've been paying Cartwright's invoices for 4 years. Yes. Someone copied them. The format, yes. Well enough to pass a quick check. She paused. Graham, Whoever did this, they've seen your real invoices, close enough to replicate the details. This isn't someone who got lucky with a guess about your accounts. He looked up from the papers. You're telling me this is someone who's been in this house, or who had access to someone in this house? Yes. The silence stretched. Outside, she could hear Clem moving around the yard, the distant sound of one of the horses making noise about something. The access question, Graham said finally. He said it like he'd been working up to it and had decided he was going to say it straight. You mentioned it after the first day. Who else has been in these records? I remember. I've been thinking about it. He moved to the window and stood looking out. His reflection in the glass was dim, overlaid on the yard outside. Jonah's been helping me file since his second month here. He's the only one besides me who'd know where things were. Where things were filed, yes, but this took more than that. Vivian thought about how to say it. Whoever did this understood the accounting system well enough to know which invoices would be checked and which wouldn't. Which sales records would raise questions if they were tampered with and which wouldn't. That's not knowledge you get from filing papers. That's knowledge you get from someone explaining the system to you, or from watching someone work in it for a long time. Graham turned from the window. Jonah's not stupid. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not saying he's stupid. I'm saying the evidence keeps coming back to someone who knew this operation from the inside, and right now he's the only person with consistent access to these records who isn't you, Clem, or Dolph. Graham's jaw worked once. Clem and Dolph have been with me since the first year. I know. They could have left 100 times for better wages. I know that too. She kept her voice even. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm telling you what the numbers are showing me. What we do with that is a different question. He stood there for a moment longer, then pulled out the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down heavily. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the fence work, the tired of someone who's been carrying a worry for a long time and has just been told it was worse than they thought. He showed up 2 winters ago, Graham said. January, middle of a cold snap. I found him sleeping in the barn. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the desk. 17 years old, said his name was Jonah Pike, said he'd come from Casper and didn't have anywhere to be. I asked him why Casper, and he said his situation there had become difficult. A pause. I didn't push it. I gave him work. Did he mention family? Said he didn't have any. Graham stopped. Something shifted in his face. He said it the way people say things they've decided to say, not the way they say things that are true. Vivian looked at him. You noticed that. I noticed it. I let it go. He was a boy, and he was cold, and he was willing to work. He rubbed the back of his neck. I thought everyone was allowed their own reasons. She let a moment pass. I'm going to need to talk to him, she said. I know, not like an accusation. I want to ask him some questions about specific records and watch how he answers. Graham nodded, slowly. Tonight, after supper. She agreed and he left, and she turned back to the invoices. She had 4 more hours of work before tonight, and she intended to use all of them. Supper that evening had the texture of something people were working hard to make normal. Dolph had made a beef stew that was genuinely good, and Clem ate 2 bowls of it and complained about the bread, which was also Dolph's, and the argument that followed had clearly been happening in some form for years. Vivian ate and listened. Graham ate and said almost nothing. Jonah ate quickly, as he always did, and then sat with his hands around his water cup and watched the door. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He was always watching the door. Not the way you watch a door when you're waiting for someone. The way you watch a door when you're afraid of who might come through it. After Clem and Dolph had gone out, Graham said, without particular weight, Jonah, Miss Holloway has some questions about the records. Mind if we sit in the main room a few minutes? Jonah looked at Graham. He looked at Vivian. The muscle in his jaw went tight. All right, he said. They moved to the main room. Vivian had brought a specific page from the records. Not her notes, just a single invoice she'd selected carefully, one where the duplication was clear but not immediately obvious. She set it on the table between them. I've been going through the supply purchase records, she said, keeping her voice conversational, and I found something I can't figure out. You helped file some of these, is that right? Yes, ma'am. Do you recognize this invoice? He looked at it. She watched his face. He recognized it. She could see the exact moment he did. A very small tightening around the eyes, quickly controlled, but there. He looked at the invoice for 2 seconds longer than he needed to for a genuine answer. "It's from Cartwright's," he said. "The feed supplier." "That's right. Do you remember anything specific about this one? It would have come in around April or May of last year." "I don't remember individual invoices, ma'am." "Of course." She nodded, like that was completely reasonable. "There's a number on it that doesn't quite match what I'd expect. Sometimes records get misfiled or renumbered. I've seen that happen. I was wondering if you knew whether anyone else ever handled these before they were filed. A different system, maybe, before you started helping?" He was looking at the invoice still. His hands were flat on the table, a conscious effort, she thought, to keep them still. "I don't know," he said. "That's all right." She gathered the paper up, unhurried. "I'll keep looking." She stood. He stood. And then he said to you, quietly, barely audible, "Is the ranch in trouble?" Vivian looked at him. His eyes were on the table. He was 16 or 17, she thought, though he looked older when he was tired and younger when he forgot to be careful, and right now he looked very young. "Why do you ask?" she said. He didn't answer. Graham was sitting across the room in his chair by the fire, and he was watching Jonah with an expression Vivian couldn't quite read. Not anger, not accusation. Something more like sadness and stubbornness braided together. "Jonah," Graham said quietly, "if something is going on, I need you to tell me." The boy's throat moved. "I can't," he said. "Why not?" He looked up then, and his eyes were not guilty, Vivian thought. Not the eyes of someone ashamed of what they'd done. They were frightened. Deeply, specifically frightened in the way of someone who was afraid of a particular thing, not a general fear. "I can't," he said again, and the flatness of it said there was a wall behind the words. He excused himself and went upstairs. Vivian sat back down. Graham stayed by the fire. Neither of them said anything for a while. "He's not a thief," Graham said finally. It came out like something he'd been holding on to. "I don't think he is either," Vivian said. Graham looked at her. "Then what?" "I think someone is using him." She said it carefully because she wasn't completely certain, but she was close. The fear in his face, it's not the fear of someone who got caught. It's the fear of someone who's been told what will happen if they stop doing what they're told. She paused. When someone falsifies records over the course of more than a year, with that level of consistency, either they're very experienced at fraud, or they're very motivated to keep going. Jonah is not an experienced fraudster. He's a teenager who grew up without much and has been scared of something since the day he arrived here. Graham stared at the fire. A log shifted and sent up a brief flare. "He said he had no family," Graham said slowly. "In Casper. He said his situation there had become difficult." They looked at each other. "I'm going to find out who owns TR Holdings," Vivian said. "And I'm going to find out who Silas Crow actually is, beyond what you've told me. Because right now I have one explanation that fits all of this, and I don't want it to be right." "What explanation?" "That this ranch has been a target for a long time. That someone identified it, placed someone inside it, and has been methodically preparing it to fail." She met his eyes. "And that Jonah didn't come here by accident." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the windows with that low whistle that the Wyoming nights produced. Graham leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "I need a drink," he said. "That seems reasonable." He got up and came back with a bottle and 2 glasses, which she hadn't expected, and poured without asking, which she didn't object to. She was not generally a whiskey drinker, but she took the glass. "Tell me about Silas Crow," she said. "Everything." So he did. The picture that emerged over the next hour was not the picture of a simple land grabber. Crow had come to Wyoming territory about 8 years ago, Graham said, with capital from somewhere nobody had quite identified in a manner that was all business and no personality. He'd started with 2 legitimate land purchases, turned them over quickly for profit, and reinvested. Within 3 years, he'd built an operation that was technically a property brokerage, but in practice seemed to be something else. something that acquired distressed ranches at below-market prices and consolidated them into larger holdings. The pattern was always the same. A ranch would start struggling, not dramatically, just the slow financial erosion that was a constant risk in this kind of work. Then a broker would appear. Thomas Greer, usually, or one of two other men who worked out of Crow's office in town. The offer would be fair-seeming but slightly low. The family, already stretched thin, would take it. 3 of the 4 ranches Graham knew about had gone through this process. The 4th, a family named Bellamy, who ran about 200 head east of the river, had tried to hold out. They'd been hit with a series of problems in the following 6 months that nobody could quite explain. Broken fences, a water source contaminated, a fire in a hay storage barn that the county marshal had listed as accidental, but that the Bellamys themselves said didn't feel accidental. They'd sold within the year. Anyone complain to the marshal? Vivian asked. Bellamy did. Marshal Holt looked into it. Graham's voice was carefully neutral. Found nothing. What's your opinion of Marshal Holt? A pause. I think he's a man who finds what he goes looking for. Vivian considered this. And Crow's office in town, is that the building on the east side of the main street? 2 stories, new paint? That's the one. Thomas Greer works out of there. Thomas Greer has worked for Crow for 2 years. Graham said it like he was tasting something unpleasant. He's good at the approach. Makes people feel comfortable. Seems reasonable. A beat. He's good at making things seem a certain way. Vivian thought about 43 letters. The warmth in the language, the careful intimacy of it, the way it had felt like someone who knew exactly which notes to play. She had thought, more than once in the early months, that Thomas Greer was perhaps the most genuinely interested person she had ever corresponded with. She'd been a target. She knew that now, had known it since the street in Caldwell, but sitting here in the quiet of this house with the full picture assembling itself, she let herself really understand it. He had sought her out specifically. Her reputation as a bookkeeper had apparently been sufficient to make her worth cultivating, worth the investment of 6 months of correspondence, worth the plan of bringing her here where she would be isolated and useful. And his own arrogance had destroyed that plan when he'd married someone else. He didn't think I'd end up employed by you, she said. Graham looked at her. He assumed I'd leave, or take some lesser work somewhere in town where I wouldn't have access to anything significant. She turned the whiskey glass slowly in her hands. Instead, I'm sitting in your study with your accounts, and I've been here 5 days, and I've already found the shape of what's been done to you. She paused. That was not the intended outcome. No, Graham said quietly. I expect it wasn't. They sat with that for a moment. Which means, Vivian said, that when they find out where I am and what I've been doing, we'll have a problem. Yes. How long before they find out? Thomas knows I was at the depot. He saw us leave together. Graham's voice was steady, but there was something taut underneath it. I'd say we have days, not weeks. Vivian nodded. She looked at her glass, then set it down. Then we need to move faster than I was planning. She stood. And we need to talk to Jonah again. Not like an investigation, like a conversation between people who are already in the same trouble and know it. Graham looked up at her. The firelight was low by now, the room half in shadow. You think he'll talk? I think he's been carrying something alone for a long time, she said, and I think he's exhausted by it. She glanced toward the stairs. People don't watch the door like that unless they're waiting for the thing they're afraid of to finally arrive. He's been waiting a long time. She went to the stairs and paused with her hand on the newel post. Graham? She looked back. What you said in town. About standing there watching what Greer was doing and deciding to stop putting things off. She held his gaze a moment. I understand it better now. You weren't just being practical. He didn't answer right away. The fire made a small sound. Get some sleep, he said. We've got work to do tomorrow. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark of her cedar-smelling room and stared at the ceiling and thought about TR holdings and duplicate invoices and a boy watching a door. And somewhere in the thinking, she fell asleep. She dreamed about ledgers that rearranged themselves when she wasn't looking. She woke before dawn and went back to the study. But Jonah came down at first light before Clem or Dolph, which she suspected was not accidental. He appeared in the study doorway and stood there for a moment, looking at the papers spread across the floor. You already know, don't you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Vivian looked up from the desk. Know what specifically? About Elsie. She didn't know that name. She said so. He came in and sat in the chair across from the desk, and he put his face in his hands for a moment and then lowered them and looked at her with the eyes of someone who was done pretending they had a choice. Elsie is my sister, he said. She's 14. When I left Casper, when I said my situation had become difficult, it was because a man named Crow had figured out that Elsie owed a debt. Our father owed the debt, actually, but our father is dead, and Crow decided we were responsible for it. Vivian's pen was still in her hand. She set it down very carefully. He told me what I had to do, Jonah said. His voice was flat, not emotionless, the flatness of someone who had processed something awful enough times that they'd worn the edges off it. Said if I kept the books the way he wanted, Elsie would be fine. She's staying with people he knows. Working, he said. Keeping her safe, he said. His hands tightened on the arms of the chair. I've been sending money every month, for my wages, to an address in Casper he gave me. And I keep doing what he wants because if I stop, he's told you what happens if you stop. Yes. The study was very quiet. Outside, a rooster was starting up somewhere near the barn, which meant it was getting close to 5. Have you seen her since you came here? No. He says she's safe. He sends me a letter sometimes in her handwriting, so I know she's alive. Jonah looked at his hands. It could be anything. Someone else writing what he tells them to? I don't know. Vivian looked at the boy. This thin, watchful boy who'd spent 2 years falsifying accounts in someone else's ranch and sending half his wages to an address he couldn't verify, on the word of a man who had taken his 14-year-old sister as leverage. And she felt something cold and very clear settle in her chest. She had thought she understood what Silas Crow was. She was revising that understanding upward. Jonah. She kept her voice level. I'm going to need you to tell me everything, every instruction you were given, every change you made to those records, every name you were given, and every address. He looked at her. If I do that, Elsie is in danger whether you cooperate with him or not, she said. He's not going to release her when this is done. People like Crow don't release leverage. They keep it until it's used up. She held his eyes. Your best chance of getting her back is helping me build something solid enough to take him apart entirely. Not just the accounting fraud, the whole structure. He was quiet for a long moment. Graham's going to know what I did, he said. Yes. He'll send me away. I don't know what he'll do, she said honestly. I can't promise you how he'll react. I can tell you that he's a fair man and that what you've told me changes the picture significantly. She paused. But I'm not going to lie to you and say there won't be consequences. There will be. There are always consequences. Jonah looked at the floor. A long moment passed, then another. All right, he said quietly. Graham appeared in the doorway. He had been up, then, had heard, or come down and found the study door ajar. He stood in the frame and looked at Jonah, and Jonah looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for several seconds. I'm sorry, Jonah said. His voice cracked on the second word. Graham was quiet. Something moved through his expression. Not simple, not quickly resolved. Tell us everything, he said finally. He came in and sat down. From the beginning, Jonah started talking. The first light came through the east window as he did, pale and unhurried, touching the papers on the floor, the open ledgers on the desk, the 3 people sitting in a small room in the middle of Wyoming with the quiet, specific weight of people who have just decided to do something that can't be undone. Jonah talked for 2 hours. He talked through the full sunrise and into the morning proper, stopping occasionally when his voice got rough, accepting the coffee that Vivian refilled without comment. He told them about Casper first, about a father who had died owing money to a man he'd borrowed from without understanding the terms, the way desperate people sometimes don't read the fine print because they can't afford to learn what it says. He told them about Crow's man arriving at the door 3 weeks after the funeral, when Jonah was 15 and Elsie was 12, and explaining in a reasonable, pleasant voice that the debt had transferred. He told them what they'd been asked to do to clear it, and what happened when they couldn't, and how Elsie had been taken, not dramatically, not violently, just absorbed into an arrangement that Crow's people called protective, and that Jonah knew was anything but. He'd been given the address in Casper, and a name and instructions to find work somewhere he could be useful, and the understanding was clear. Be useful, keep sending money, keep his mouth shut, and his sister would be fine. He had found Graham's ranch by asking around Caldwell about who was hiring and ending up directed to a man who was known to be decent and who was, Crow's people had apparently decided, worth targeting. He knew about the ranch before you arrived, Vivian said. Jonah nodded. The man who gave me my instructions knew what it would look like from the inside, what records there were and roughly where they'd be. He told me what changes to make and when. He was specific. Did you ever meet Crow himself? Once, in Casper before I left. He came to tell me personally that Elsie would be well cared for. Jonah said it with a flatness that had nothing peaceful in it. He wanted me to understand that the arrangement was between him and me, that if I told anyone, or if the work stopped, the arrangement would change. Graham had said almost nothing through all of this. He was sitting in the same chair he'd pulled up at the start, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and he was listening with the absolute attention of a man who was putting something together as he went. When Jonah finished, the silence lasted a good while. Did they tell you how long? Graham asked. The arrangement. No. So there was no end to it? No. Jonah looked at his hands. I kept thinking if I did it long enough, they'd let her go. But they never said when that would be. They just kept saying she was fine, keep going, don't do anything stupid. He stopped. I knew it wasn't going to end. I've known for a while. I just didn't. His voice broke once, quietly, and he stopped and put it back together. I didn't know what else to do. Graham sat back. He looked at the ceiling. Something was working through his expression that was taking its time resolving. You should have told me, he said finally. I know. I'm not. Graham stopped, started again. I'm not saying that to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm saying I could have helped a year ago, 8 months ago. He looked at Jonah directly. I would have. Jonah didn't say anything. He was looking at the floor and his jaw was very tight. That's done now, Vivian said, not harshly but definitively. They could not afford to spend the morning in recrimination. She looked at Graham. What Jonah has given us is more than the accounting fraud. He can testify to coercion, to Crow personally delivering instructions, to the existence of a system of leverage that's been used across multiple operations if the other ranches went the same way. She paused. This is not a bookkeeping case anymore. This is criminal conspiracy across territory lines, possibly federal jurisdiction. Graham looked at her. Which means, she continued, that Marshal Holt is not the right authority. No, Graham agreed, and the word was dry as chalk. Is there a federal judge in this circuit? Judge Ambrose Keene. He rides the circuit out of Cheyenne, comes through Caldwell every 6 weeks or so. Graham thought for a moment. He's due through in about 3 weeks. 3 weeks is too long to wait if Crow already suspects something is wrong. Vivian turned back to the desk, and the papers spread across it. I need to get everything organized into a package that can be sent directly to Keene in Cheyenne. A complete record, the accounting fraud, the shell company, the invoice duplication, Jonah's testimony in written form. She was already sorting as she talked, her hands moving through the papers. If we can get it to him before Crow moves against us, we control the timing. And if we can't, she looked up, then we need a contingency for that situation as well. The morning light had shifted while they were talking. It was past 7 now, and outside Vivian could hear Clem and Dolph starting up their routines. The barn, the horses, the particular sounds of a working ranch coming into its day. Neither of them had any idea what had happened in this room in the past 2 hours. Jonah, Graham said, I need you to act normal today. Work, eat, don't avoid anyone. Can you do that? Jonah looked up. He seemed surprised to be asked if he could do it rather than told to. Yes. If anyone comes from town asking questions, you tell me immediately. Don't engage. Graham stood. And Jonah, Sir, we're going to get her back. He said it simply, not like a promise wrapped in sentiment, just like a statement of intention. The way he might say they were going to fix the south fence. That's not negotiable. Jonah looked at him for a long moment and then looked away quickly. And the brief expression that crossed his face before he controlled it was something Vivian decided not to name. He went out to work. She turned back to the desk. She spent the next 4 days building the case. It was the most focused work she'd done since her first year in St. Louis, when she'd spent 3 weeks untangling a set of hotel accounts that the previous bookkeeper had left in a state of creative catastrophe. That had been complicated. This was complicated and dangerous, which was a different kind of focus, sharper, with less tolerance for error. She organized the accounting evidence into a clean chronological record: the cattle sales manipulation, the TR Holdings shell, the invoice duplication scheme. She calculated total losses with documentation for each figure. She cross-referenced Jonah's testimony, which she wrote out with him over 2 evenings slowly, making sure every detail was accurate and signed, against the records themselves, showing where his instructions had produced specific changes in the accounts. She also found something else. It was buried deep in the oldest records, a set of correspondence that Graham had filed years ago, and more or less forgotten about. Letters from a land assessor who had done a survey of the property for reasons Graham couldn't quite remember authorizing. The letters were technical and dry, and on the surface unremarkable. But when Vivian read them against what she now knew about Crow's acquisition pattern, something stood out. The assessor's letters described the ranch's water rights in significant detail. Specifically, the underground water access that served not just this property, but could potentially serve 3 adjacent properties if properly developed. It was, the assessor noted, one of the most valuable subsurface water rights in the northern part of the territory. Graham hadn't registered it as significant at the time. He was a cattleman, not a land speculator. She brought him the letters on the 3rd evening. He read them at the kitchen table while she sat across from him, and she watched his face change as he got toward the end. "He doesn't just want the ranch," Graham said. "He wants what's under it." Vivian folded her hands on the table. "If he acquires this property, he controls water access for 3 surrounding parcels, which means he controls whether those properties can sustain livestock operations, which means eventually he can pressure those owners to sell as well." Graham set the letters down. "How many acres does that affect?" "If the assessor's survey is accurate, somewhere between 8 and 12,000 acres total, once you include the adjacent properties." She paused. "At current land values, conservative estimate, we're talking about a consolidation worth 3 to 4 times what the individual ranches are worth separately." Graham stared at the letters. "This is why he targeted you specifically," she said. "The accounting fraud wasn't just about grinding you down financially, it was timed. He's been preparing this property for acquisition on a schedule, long enough to establish distress, not so long that something might change. Like someone coming in and reading the accounts." "Like that, yes." He looked up. "Vivian, why did he want you?" She had been waiting for him to ask. She had been thinking about how to say it. "He didn't want me," she said. "He wanted a bookkeeper who could manage accounts with enough skill to make everything look legitimate once he'd taken over. The plan was for me to arrive, marry Thomas Greer, and end up embedded in Crow's operation." She stopped. "Unwittingly? I would have been protecting their records without knowing what they were." Graham was very still. "My reputation apparently made it back to someone in Crow's network," she said, keeping her voice level. Thomas's 6 months of correspondence were an investment in acquiring a useful professional asset. She paused. "He just got impatient, or something changed with Margaret, and he abandoned the plan before it came to fruition. He threw away 6 months of work because he couldn't wait. He didn't think I'd be a problem either way. A woman alone, 800 miles from home, publicly humiliated. The expected outcome was that I'd leave or disappear into some quiet corner." She met Graham's eyes. "He did not anticipate that you would cross the street." Something happened in Graham's face. Not quite an expression, more like the precursor to one, something that moved through and then went still. "Neither did I, particularly," he said. Which was the most honest thing he'd said about that moment, she thought. They sat with that for a moment. "The package for Judge Keene," she said, returning to practical ground. "I'll have it ready in 2 days. I want to send it with someone who isn't connected to this ranch, someone Crow's people won't flag. There's a man named August Toll who rides the mail contract between here and Cheyenne. He's reliable and he doesn't talk. Can you get word to him without going into Caldwell yourself? He passes the North Road Tuesdays and Fridays. Friday's tomorrow. Then I'll be ready by tomorrow morning." She gathered the letters and stood. "Graham, there's one more thing." He waited. Thomas Greer. She said the name plainly, without inflection. He's not peripheral to this. He's been the acquisition point, the person who makes the initial approach, who builds the relationship with the target before the offer comes. The Bellamy's, the other ranches. All of it runs through him. She held Graham's gaze. He's part of the criminal structure, not just an employee. Graham's expression was something she couldn't read exactly. That doesn't surprise me. It means when this comes apart, he goes with it. A pause. I want you to know I'm not doing this because of what he did to me. I'm doing it because the evidence requires it. I know that, Graham said quietly. Good. She turned for the study. Good night. Good night. She heard him sit there a while before he moved. The package was sealed and ready by 4 a.m. on Friday. Vivienne had not slept. She'd come close around 2 and then surfaced again with the specific anxiety of someone who is afraid of missing a detail, and she'd gotten up and gone through everything one more time. The cover letter to Judge Keene was clear and precise, laying out the nature of the evidence and the urgency of the timeline. The accounting documents were organized chronologically with a summary page. Jonah's written testimony was signed and witnessed by Graham. The assessor's letters were included with an explanatory note connecting them to the acquisition pattern. It was, she thought, as solid as she could make it with what she had. Whether it was solid enough was a question that wouldn't be answered in this room. Graham met August Toll at the North Road at 7 a.m. and came back an hour later. He came into the study and said, "It's on its way," and she let out a breath she'd been holding since before dawn. How long to Cheyenne? 2 days, if the weather holds. Graham pulled off his hat and set it on the corner of the desk. He looked tired in the way she was learning to recognize. Not physical tired, which he seemed to have a significant tolerance for, but the tired of sustained tension. Keene's office will receive it by Monday. And then? Then we wait to see if he acts on it before Crow acts on us. The morning was cold, sharper than it had been. The first suggestion of real autumn in the air. Through the study window, Vivienne could see the grass moving in a steady northwest wind, the cottonwoods along the fence line beginning to drop their leaves in small, spinning clusters. She became aware that Graham was looking at her. "When did you last sleep properly?" he asked. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Tuesday night, probably, in stretches." He nodded once, not approvingly. "You should rest today. The work is done. There's nothing more you can do on the evidence until Keene responds." "I'm aware of that." "Then act on it." She almost said she was fine again, and then didn't, because it would have been untrue and he would have known it. She was not fine. She was wrung out in a way that had as much to do with the past week and a half of her life as it did with the past few days of work. The accumulation of it, Thomas Greer and the street in Caldwell, and the 43 letters and the study floor and Jonah's face, and the specific weight of having built something important enough that its destruction would matter, had settled into her body in a way that she hadn't let herself feel while there was work in front of her. "All right," she said. She went upstairs and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the east window, and then she slept. And it was the deepest sleep she'd had in 2 weeks. She woke to voices downstairs. Not alarmed voices, but tense, the kind of conversation that's being kept controlled. She was dressed and at the top of the stairs in under a minute. Graham was in the main room. With him was a man Vivienne hadn't seen before. Tall, well-dressed for Caldwell, with the particular groomed quality of someone who made an effort at appearance as a professional tool. He had a pleasant face and the manner of someone who was very used to making people feel at ease. She recognized the type immediately. She'd seen it across a desk and in 43 letters. "Miss Holloway," Graham said, and his voice was carefully normal. "This is Edmund Ferris. He works with the Crow Property Office." Ferris turned and looked at her with the warm, slightly surprised expression of a man encountering something he's reassessing in real time. "Miss Holloway, I'd heard Mr. Ashcroft had taken on some help with his accounts." "Word travels," she said. She came down the stairs at a pace she made herself keep unhurried. "It does in a small territory." Ferris smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without looking practiced. "I was actually just telling Mr. Ashcroft that our office has been concerned about some of the ranching operations in the area. It's been a difficult few years. Mr. Crow is genuinely interested in supporting the community." "That's generous of him," Vivienne said. He's a man who takes the long view. Ferris glanced around the room with the easy assessment of someone who'd been in many houses for this same reason. We've been able to help several families in the area navigate difficult circumstances. If Mr. Ashcroft were ever in a position where he wanted to discuss options, he's not, Vivian said pleasantly. Ferris looked at her. The smile stayed, but something recalibrated behind it. The accounts are in better shape than they might appear from the outside, she continued in the tone of someone discussing weather. I've been going through them this past week. There were some irregularities, recording errors mostly. But once those are corrected, the picture is actually quite sound. She met his eyes with an expression of helpful professionalism. I'd hate for anyone to draw inaccurate conclusions about the operation's health based on incomplete information. The pause that followed was very brief, but she felt it. Well, Ferris said, that's excellent news. The warmth in his voice hadn't moved, but something underneath it had. I'll certainly pass that along. He made his goodbyes with perfect manners and left. Graham and Vivian stood in the main room and listened to his horse leave the yard. He'll report back today, Vivian said. Yes. We just told them the fraud has been discovered without telling them we've documented it. She turned to Graham. They're going to want to know exactly what I found and what I've done with it. Which means they'll come back. Not Ferris. No. Someone with more authority. She thought about the timeline. The package was on its way to Cheyenne. Monday, at the earliest, Keene's office would receive it. Response time after that was unknown. We need to be ready for them to move before we get any answer from Keene. Graham nodded slowly. What do you want to do? She had been thinking about this since Ferris knocked on the door. The shape of it had come to her while she was coming down the stairs, and it was not a comfortable shape, but it was the one that made sense. I want to make them think they have something to gain from waiting, she said, and I want to have something ready for them if they don't. She went back to the study. The evidence was gone, sent with August Toll, but she still had the raw materials, the ledgers, the invoices, the things they'd already seen. She sat down and started writing. Not a summary for a judge this time, a different document entirely, one that looked like everything, but wasn't. That referenced figures without giving the complete record. That implied she was still compiling, still organizing, had not yet sent anything anywhere. A document that would be convincing to someone who grabbed it in a hurry and didn't have time to read carefully. She worked through the afternoon. Outside, the wind came up harder from the northwest and the temperature dropped noticeably, and Clem put his head in the study door at one point and said there might be early snow, and she said thank you without looking up. By evening, she had what she needed. She put it in a leather satchel that had been sitting in the corner of the study since her first day here. Old, worn at the corners, substantial looking. She filled it with the false document on top and the real ledgers beneath, where they would look like supporting material. Then she removed the real ledgers and replaced them with blank pages and outdated receipts. The satchel, when closed, felt exactly like what it appeared to be. A bookkeeper's working file. Heavy with documentation. Important. She set it on the corner of the desk. Graham appeared in the doorway that evening and looked at the satchel and then at her. What is that? That, she said, is what we'll give them if they come for us before Keene responds. He looked at the satchel for a moment. And the real evidence? Is already in Cheyenne. She met his eyes. Everything that matters is already out of our hands. The only thing they can take from us now is something that won't help them. He was quiet for a long moment. They're not going to be happy when they figure that out. No, she agreed. They won't be. She had known, building this, that it was the kind of plan that had a significant gap in the middle. The part where the criminals discovered they'd been fooled and still had people to take their anger out on. She had not found a way to close that gap entirely. What she had was the timing and the evidence already sent, and the hope that federal authority moved faster than criminal fury. It was not by any measure a comfortable position, but she had walked into a Wyoming town with $34, an address she'd pressed in Missouri, and she had been handed a public humiliation in front of a crowd that laughed, and she was still here. She thought about Thomas Greer's voice. Look on the bright side, you've had a chance to see Wyoming. And she looked at the satchel on the desk and felt, for the first time in 11 days, something that wasn't fear or exhaustion or the specific weight of sustained concentration. She felt very quietly the beginning of something like readiness. It was not comfortable. but it was hers. They came on Sunday. Not Ferris this time. 3 men on horseback arriving at the ranch just past noon while Clem and Dolph were out on the east pasture and Jonah was in the barn. Vivian heard them from the study, the sound of horses coming in fast and then pulling up hard in the yard, the kind of arrival that doesn't bother with politeness. She was at the desk. She put her hand flat on the satchel and looked at the door. Graham's boots crossed the main room. She heard the front door open. Ashcroft. The voice was one she didn't recognize. Flat, not local, with the particular toneless quality of someone who'd trained the warmth out of it on purpose. "We need to speak with you." "You're on my property," Graham said. "You can speak with me from there." A pause. "Come down off the porch." "I'll stand where I like on my own land." She moved to the study doorway so she could see the front windows. Through the glass, she could make out Graham at the top of the porch steps and the 3 men in the yard below him. 2 she didn't recognize, 1 she did. Thomas Greer was sitting his horse on the left, and he was looking at the house with the focused attention of someone who is looking for something specific, not at Graham. He was looking for her. She stepped back from the doorway. "Mr. Crow would like to discuss the accounting work your employee has been doing," said the flat voice. The speaker was the man in the middle, heavy-set, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather, with the patient manner of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room. "He understands she's been going through your records. My accounts are my business. They become Mr. Crow's business when they contain inaccuracies that affect his interests." Graham said nothing. He was good at that, at letting silences sit without filling them, which was perhaps the most effective negotiating posture in existence. "We'd like to speak with Miss Holloway directly," said the man in the coat. "She's not available." "That's going to be a problem." The weight in those 4 words was not subtle. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them and picked up the satchel. She walked through the main room and out the front door and stood beside Graham on the porch. Thomas Greer's expression when he saw her was interesting. It moved through several things quickly. Surprise that she was still here, a reassessment of the situation, and then something that settled into a careful pleasantness that she recognized as his working face. "Vivian," he said, "you look well." "Thomas." She looked at the man in the coat. "You must be someone important. You have that air." The man looked at her without expression. "My name is Aldrich Ness. I manage certain interests for Mr. Crow." His eyes went to the satchel in her hand. "Is that the documentation you've been compiling?" "Some of it." "We'd like to see it." "I imagine you would." She held the satchel at her side, not offering it, not pulling it away. "What exactly does Mr. Crow think I've found?" "He's not certain. That's why we're here." "To find out." "To resolve a misunderstanding," Ness said. The word misunderstanding landed with the particular weight of a word being used to mean its opposite. Mr. Crow is a reasonable man. If there are concerns about how his interests have intersected with this operation, he'd prefer to address them privately. "Privately," Graham said from beside her. "It's a better outcome for everyone." Graham made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Better for Crow." "Better for you," Ness said, and this time the pleasantness was entirely gone. "Mr. Ashcroft, you have a ranch that has been struggling for some time. You have a young hand who has made some significant errors in your accounts. You have a woman who arrived here 10 days ago with nothing and has been going through records she may not fully understand." He looked at Vivian when he said it. "Mr. Crow is offering a resolution, a fair price for this property, a clean start somewhere else. Whatever Miss Holloway has compiled stays here, with us, and everyone moves forward." The offer was delivered with the smoothness of something that had been said before. It had probably worked before. Vivian looked at the satchel in her hand. She thought about August toll on the road to Cheyenne. She thought about a cover letter addressed to Judge Ambrose Keene and the specific weight of a sealed package placed in a mail carrier's hands on a cold Friday morning. "That's a generous offer," she said. "It is." "Can I have a moment to consider it?" Ness looked at her for a moment, measuring. "A short one." She turned to Graham and took a step toward him, dropping her voice. His head came down automatically to hear her. "They're going to take the satchel," she said quietly. "Let them." His eyes moved to the bag. "Vivian, trust me." She held his gaze. "Let them take it and get me into that building. Then get Jonah to Casper." A long beat. His jaw moved once. He was not a man who liked plans he hadn't been part of making, and she could see the resistance in him, the instinct to argue, to find another way, to not send her somewhere alone with these people. Graham. She kept her voice very low and very steady. The real evidence is already gone. There's nothing in this satchel that can hurt us. The only move they have left is to think they've won. She paused. Let them think it. He looked at her for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. All right, he said, barely audible. Then, louder, to Ness. We'll come to Crow's office this afternoon. Ness nodded. It was the nod of a man who had expected this outcome. 2 o'clock. Just Mr. Ashcroft and Miss Holloway. They rode back the way they'd come. Thomas Greer went with them without looking back, which told Vivian that whatever he felt about this situation, he'd made his peace with his role in it some time ago. She and Graham stood on the porch until the sound of horses had faded north toward the road. Jonah, Graham said. Yes. Now, before 2 o'clock. He needs to go to Casper and find Elsie before anyone tells Crow that this meeting didn't go the way he planned. She looked at him. Once Crow opens that satchel and finds blank pages, whatever arrangement he has with whoever is holding that girl, it ends badly. We need Jonah there first. Graham was already moving toward the barn. They told Jonah in the barn, quick and plain. He went white when he understood what the plan required. You're going into Crow's office, he said. Alone. With Graham? Yes. That's not the same as not alone. He looked between them. These aren't careful men. They burned the Bellamy barn. They need to think they have what they want before they do anything else. That buys time. Vivian looked at him steadily. Jonah? Elsie. How much do you know about where she's being held? He knew more than she'd expected. He'd pieced it together from the letters, from small details that accumulated over 2 years. An address in Casper he'd sent money to, a name, Mrs. Hargrove, who Crow's people had described as a respectable boarding house keeper, but who Jonah suspected kept her residence less voluntarily than the word boarding suggested. Can you find it? Yes? Do you have money? Some. Graham had already gone to the house and come back with more, which he pressed into Jonah's hand without ceremony. Take the gray, he said. She's faster than the roan, and she won't tire on the road. Jonah looked at the money in his hand and then at Graham. What if it doesn't work? What if you go in there and then you get Elsie out anyway, Graham said. That doesn't change regardless of what happens to us. Something crossed Jonah's face that was too complicated to name. He closed his hand around the money. Go, Vivian said. Don't stop in Caldwell. He went. They heard the gray move out of the barn at a canter, and then the sound faded south, toward the Casper Road. Graham and Vivian stood in the empty barn for a moment. Clem and Dolph, she said. I'll tell them to stay out on the east pasture until evening. If they don't hear from me by dark... He stopped. Restarted. I'll leave a note in the kitchen telling them to go to the county seat, not to Holt. She nodded. He looked at her then, and it was a longer look than he usually gave anything. Not examining her exactly. More like someone who was trying to fix a thing in memory and wasn't sure why they were doing it. You could stay here, he said. I could go in alone. Tell them you wouldn't come. They want me. The accounts are mine. If you go without me, they'll know something is wrong before we're ready for them to know. I know that. He paused. I'm saying you don't have to be the one who goes in there. Yes, I do. She said it without drama. I'm the one who knows what's in the satchel and what isn't. If they ask me anything specific, I need to be there to answer it credibly. She held his eyes. And I'm the one who found it all. I'm not going to sit here while someone else carries it into that room. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said, like the first time she'd asked him to trust her. The same 2 words, the same quality of decision in them. They went back to the house. She changed into her better dress, which she'd pressed the day before without fully knowing why. She took the satchel from the desk and held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it. All that emptiness dressed up to look substantial. Then she picked up her notebook and her pen and put them in her coat pocket because she was not going into that room without something to write with. Crow's office was the 2-story building on the east side of Caldwell's main street, the one with the new paint that Graham had pointed out weeks ago. Up close, it was deliberately impressive. Solid construction, large windows, a brass plate beside the door that read Crow's Land and Property in engraved letters. The kind of building designed to communicate permanence and authority. Ness was waiting at the door. He looked at the satchel in Vivian's hand and held the door open without a word. Inside was a wide front room with a desk and 2 chairs, and the kind of careful neatness that signals that whoever works here is not actually concerned with work, but with appearances. A staircase led up to the right. Ness gestured toward it. The upper room was larger. It had a long table, 6 chairs, and a man sitting at the far end who Vivian understood immediately was Silas Crow. He was not what she'd expected. She had assembled an image of him from everything she'd been told. The barn fires, the leveraged families, the 2-year campaign against Graham's ranch. And the image was of someone hard and sharp and cold. The man at the table was in his late 50s, with a round, almost gentle face, the look of someone's prosperous uncle. He was well dressed without being showy. He had very blue eyes, and he was looking at her with what appeared to be genuine interest. The most dangerous ones, her father had told her once when she was 12, are the ones who don't look like what they are. He'd been talking about a man who cheated him on a lumber contract. She'd thought she understood the warning at the time. She understood it better now. Thomas Greer was standing against the wall to the left. He looked at Vivian when she came in and then looked away. There was one other man in the room, younger, seated at the table with paper and pen, clearly there to record whatever was said. A deliberate choice on Crow's part, she thought. Creating a record of the meeting was the move of someone confident they controlled the narrative. "Miss Holloway," Crow said. His voice was warm, actually warm, which was worse than if it had been cold. "Please sit down, Mr. Ashcroft." They sat across from him. The satchel went on the table between them. "I appreciate you coming in," Crow said. "I know this has been an unsettling time. I want you to know that none of what's happened in the past weeks has been intended personally." He said it with what appeared to be sincerity. Business arrangements sometimes create situations that look worse from the outside than they are. "That's an interesting description of accounting fraud," Vivian said. The warmth in Crow's expression shifted by about 3 degrees. Not gone, but recalibrated. "I think there may have been some misinterpretation of how certain transactions were recorded. It's easily explained." "I'd be very interested to hear the explanation for TR Holdings," she said. "Specifically, who owns it and why it appears on 17 separate livestock sale records at systematically below market rates." "Miss Holloway." Crow's voice was patient. Patient in the way that power is patient when it's certain of the outcome. "I think we can resolve this more simply." His eyes moved to the satchel. "What you've been compiling, the documents, the records. Let's start there. What exactly do you have?" She looked at the satchel, then at him. "Everything," she said. She slid the satchel across the table toward him. He looked at it. He didn't reach for it immediately, which told her he was not a man who grabbed things. He waited for other people to do the reaching. He nodded to Ness, who was standing behind and to the right. Ness picked up the satchel, opened it, and removed the document on top. The room was quiet while he read. Vivian watched his face. Graham was very still beside her. Thomas Greer had moved his weight from one foot to the other and was now looking at the floor. Ness read for 30 seconds. Then he turned the first page, then the second. He flipped through faster, and she could see the moment he understood. A very slight, very controlled change in his expression, like a door closing. He set the document down and opened the satchel wider and looked at what was underneath. Blank pages, outdated receipts, 3 old invoices for hay that hadn't been filed properly 2 years ago. He looked at Vivian. "Where's the real documentation?" he said. "That is the documentation," she said pleasantly. "Miss Holloway." Ness's voice had lost its professional texture. "Where are the accounting records?" "You're looking at them." Crow was watching her now with an expression that was no longer warm at all. The uncle face was gone. What was underneath it was quiet and specific, and not the kind of thing she was going to let herself look at directly. "You sent it," Crow said. Not a question. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't." He said it very quietly. The single word had more weight than the entire preceding conversation. "Don't pretend. You're not built for pretending." He studied her with those very blue eyes. You sent the documentation to someone before you came here. Federal court, I assume. Judge Keene's circuit. The room was extremely quiet. Here's what you don't understand, Crow said after a moment. He stood up. He was taller than he'd appeared sitting. A letter to a circuit judge is not a conviction. It's a conversation. I have had many conversations with Judge Keene over the years. I have had many conversations with many people. He moved around the end of the table, unhurried. What you've done today is not end this. You've started a process that I have considerably more experience navigating than you do. He stopped about 6 feet from the table and looked at her directly. And in the meantime, he said, you are in my building, and the documentation you believe is your protection is already in transit, which means you have nothing left to offer me in exchange for your situation improving. Graham moved. It was fast. He was out of his chair and had put himself between Vivian and Crow before she'd fully registered he was moving. And Ness moved at the same time from the other direction, and for a moment the room was a compressed space of people calculating distances and outcomes. Stop! Vivian stood up. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and it cut through the room. Everyone went still. She looked at Crow. You're right, she said. The documentation is gone. You can't take it back. She held his eyes. And you're right that a letter to a judge isn't a conviction. It's a conversation. She paused. But here is what the conversation contains. $5,000 in documented accounting fraud, the testimony of a material witness who can describe being coerced by you personally, a shell company traced back to your operation through 3 separate transaction chains, and a land assessor's survey that establishes motive for a pattern of property acquisition by coercion across this territory. She kept her voice level. That's not a conversation, Mr. Crow. That is a federal case. The young man with the paper and pen had stopped writing at some point. She didn't know when. Crow looked at her for a long moment. You're very confident for someone standing in my office with nothing. I'm standing in your office with nothing because everything I had is already where you can't reach it. She held his gaze. That's not confidence. That's arithmetic. The silence stretched. And then, from downstairs, there was the sound of the front door opening. Boots on the floor below. More than one person. Ness turned toward the staircase. Thomas Greer, still against the wall, said very quietly, Aldrich. The boots were on the stairs now, several pairs, measured, not rushed. The man who appeared at the top of the stairs was wearing a coat that carried the specific cut of federal authority. Not a uniform exactly, but something close enough to one that it functioned as one. He was followed by 2 others of similar bearing. Behind them, slightly breathless and still holding his hat from the ride, was August Toll. Vivian looked at him. August Toll looked back at her with the expression of a man who had ridden very hard for 3 days and was glad he had. I carry the mail contract to Cheyenne, he said, to nobody in particular. And I may have made an extra stop at Judge Keene's chambers on my way back through. The federal man, he identified himself as Deputy Marshal Connors, out of the federal court in Cheyenne, had 3 warrants. He read the names from them with the unhurried delivery of someone performing a legal obligation rather than an arrest. Silas Crow. Aldrich Ness. And a third name that made Thomas Greer go very still against the wall. His own. Thomas Greer, Connors said, you are named as a co-conspirator in the matter of fraudulent land acquisition and coercion in violation of federal statutes. Thomas looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. She thought about the curtain she'd said would be blue, and 43 letters, and the specific calculation he'd made when he'd decided she was useful, but not enough to treat as a person. She thought about the crowd on that street in Caldwell and the sound of their laughter. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. Thomas looked away first. The arrests were not dramatic. Crow did not resist. He stood with his hands at his sides and allowed Connors to do what Connors was there to do, and his face had returned to its uncle expression, which was perhaps the thing she found most disturbing. The seamlessness of it, the performance that ran all the way to the end. Ness was less composed. He said several things that Connors ignored. Thomas said nothing at all. Graham was beside her now. He'd crossed the room while the arrests were happening, and he was standing close enough that she was aware of the steadiness of him, the specific, unhurried steadiness that she'd first noticed on a street in Caldwell when everyone else was laughing. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She took a breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she registered without judgment. They had been shaking for the last 10 minutes, since the moment she'd pushed the empty satchel across the table, and she hadn't let herself notice until now. "I'll tell you in a minute," she said honestly. He nodded. Like that was a complete answer. Downstairs through the window, she could see people beginning to gather on the street outside. The same street where, 2 weeks ago, she had stepped off a train and walked into a situation designed to break her. The faces in the gathering crowd were not laughing now. They were the stunned faces of people watching the collapse of something they'd understood as permanent. Connors reappeared at the top of the stairs. "Miss Holloway, we'll need your testimony in Cheyenne within the week. Can you arrange that?" "Yes." "The documentation you sent was thorough. Judge Keene said—" He paused, looking for the right word. He said it was the cleanest case file he'd received from a non-attorney in his 20 years on the circuit. She absorbed that. "Tell him I've had good practice," she said. Connors looked at her for a moment and then nodded and went back downstairs. Graham was still beside her. The room was emptying out around them. Connors and his men, Crow and Ness, Thomas Greer with his hands bound and his face turned away. The young man with the paper and pen had gone, leaving his notes behind on the table. Vivienne looked at the notes. Then she looked at the empty satchel on the floor where Ness had dropped it. Then she looked at the window and the street below and the gathering crowd and the late afternoon light that had come over Caldwell's rooftops at a low angle. The kind of October light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is. "Jonah," she said. "He's had 6 hours," Graham said. "If he made good time." "He made good time." She said it with more certainty than she had evidence for, but she found she believed it. Graham looked at her sideways. "How do you know?" "Because he's been moving toward that girl for 2 years, she said. He was always going to make good time when he finally had permission. They stood there a moment longer. Then Graham picked up the empty satchel from the floor and looked at it with an expression that was almost amused, in the particular way of someone who has been genuinely afraid and is now on the other side of it. "Blank pages," he said. "Blank pages," she agreed. He held the door for her at the top of the stairs, and she went through it, and they walked down and out of Crow's building and into the cold October air and the small commotion of the street below, where the story was already changing shape in people's mouths, becoming the thing it would be told as for years, which was fine, she thought. Let them tell it however they needed to. She knew what had actually happened. She had walked into that room with an empty bag and the knowledge that everything that mattered was already somewhere she couldn't lose it, and she had sat across from a man who frightened her and not let him see it, and she had waited for the arithmetic to come out right. It had. That was enough for now. The evening was coming in fast from the west, the sky going the deep, complicated blue of Wyoming autumn, and the air smelled like cold grass and wood smoke and the first suggestion of snow still some days off. Graham walked beside her through the thinning crowd, not touching her, not saying anything, just there, the way he had been there since a Tuesday afternoon on this same street when he'd decided to cross it. She did not reach for his arm, but she walked close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and neither of them moved away. And that was its own kind of language, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. Jonah came back 4 days later. He rode in on a gray afternoon with Elsie sitting behind him on the horse, her arms around his waist, and her face pressed against his shoulder blade, the way people hold on to things they thought they'd lost. They came up the north road at a walk because the gray was tired, and Vivian saw them from the study window and went outside without her coat. Elsie Pike was 14 years old and small for it, with the same dark eyes as her brother and the careful, watchful quality of someone who had spent a significant stretch of time in a situation that required watchfulness. She slid down from the horse when Jonah stopped in the yard and stood looking at the ranch house and the barn and the open land around it with an expression that Vivian couldn't quite categorize. Not relief exactly, more like the face of someone recalibrating what safety looks like. Jonah dismounted and stood beside her. He looked at Vivian over his sister's head. "Mrs. Hargrove wasn't what Crow said she was," he said. His voice was careful, telling her this in front of Elsie for a reason, because Elsie already knew it, and there was no point in pretending she didn't. "It was a working house. Elsie was—" He stopped. "She's all right. She's here." Vivian looked at Elsie directly. "You're welcome here as long as you need to be." Elsie looked back at her with those careful eyes. "I don't need pity," she said. Her voice was flat, which was its own kind of dignity. "Good," Vivian said. "I'm not offering any. I'm offering a room and meals and the general chaos of a working ranch." She paused. "It's not comfortable exactly, but it's honest." Something in Elsie's expression shifted, very slightly. Not warmth yet. That would take time, Vivian knew, more time than 4 days. But the beginning of consideration. The reopening of a calculation she'd thought was closed. Graham appeared on the porch behind Vivian. He looked at Jonah and then at Elsie, and he took the measure of the situation in the way he took the measure of most things, quickly, without performing the measuring. "Take the gray to the barn," he said to Jonah. "She's earned a rest." Then to Elsie, "There's stew on. You look like you haven't eaten since Wednesday." Elsie blinked. "I ate yesterday." "Stew's still there." It was not by any measure a warm welcome, but it was a real one. And Vivian had come to understand in the weeks she'd spent in this house that Graham Ashcroft communicated care through practicality, through the braided rug put in a storage room, through coffee poured without asking, through a stew left on the stove for someone who hadn't eaten since yesterday. Elsie went inside. Jonah took the gray to the barn. Graham went back to whatever he'd been doing. Vivian stood in the cold yard for a moment by herself and looked at the sky, which was the heavy gray of coming snow, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't announce itself. Well, the trial testimony happened in Cheyenne the following week. Vivian rode down with Graham and spent 2 days in Judge Keene's court, going through her documentation with the methodical precision she'd used to build it. The federal prosecutor was a capable young man named Dreyer, who'd done his homework with the materials she'd sent and asked intelligent questions. And she answered them the way she answered every accounting question, directly, without editorializing, letting the numbers make the argument themselves. Crow's attorney tried twice to challenge her qualifications. Judge Keene, who was 70 years old and had the patience of someone who had heard every possible variety of courtroom theater, overruled him both times with an economy of words that she admired. The third time he said, "The witness's documentation speaks for itself, counselor. I've reviewed it. Unless you have a substantive objection to the arithmetic, we'll proceed." The arithmetic was not challenged. Ness testified against Crow in exchange for a reduced charge, which Vivian found predictable. Crow himself said almost nothing. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his uncle face on, and when the verdict came down on the second day, he received it with the same composed expression he'd worn throughout, which suggested to her that he had already decided who he was going to be in this moment, and was committing to it all the way down. What he was convicted of was extensive enough that the commitment didn't matter much. Fraud, coercion, criminal conspiracy in the acquisition of property through fraudulent means. The sentences were read aloud in the specific dry language of legal proceeding, and Vivian sat in the gallery and listened to each count and thought about the Bellamy family's burned barn and a boy watching a door for 2 years and 43 letters that had been an investment strategy rather than correspondence. Thomas Greer entered a guilty plea on the second morning, which saved everyone time. He stood before the judge and said the required words and did not look at the gallery, which was a mercy she hadn't asked for but accepted. The last time she saw him, he was being escorted out of the courtroom by a court officer, and the back of his head looked exactly like the back of anyone's head, which was the most clarifying thing about him she'd encountered yet. She had spent 6 months believing those letters were a window into a particular human being. They had been a product, carefully manufactured for a specific purpose. The man who'd manufactured them was ordinary enough in the end. That was the thing she had to keep reminding herself. Not that he was a monster, but that he was ordinary. That the ordinary ones could do damage just as well, given the right motivation and the right opportunity. Jonah's testimony was the last one. He sat in the witness box and answered Dreyer's questions in the careful, flat voice of someone who had rehearsed being truthful so many times it had become its own kind of armor. He described Crow's instructions. He described the arrangement with Elsie. He described 2 years of falsifying records in a house where the man who owned it had given him food and a place to sleep and had asked him nothing about Casper. At one point, Dreyer asked him how he felt about what he'd done. Jonah was quiet for a moment. "I felt like I didn't have a choice," he said, "and then I met someone who showed me what a choice actually looks like." He paused. I should have made it sooner. Dreyer nodded and moved to his next question. Vivian was looking at her hands in her lap. Beside her, Graham was looking at the witness box with an expression she wasn't going to describe, because some things between people don't belong to the person watching them. The families came back in the spring. Not all of them. Some had moved on too far, put down roots somewhere else, built new lives out of necessity. But 3 families whose ranches had been taken through Crow's acquisition network were identified in the federal proceeding, and the land transfers were voided, and the process of returning what had been taken began, slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of legal complexity that Vivian ended up assisting with, because it turned out that nobody in the county had the accounting background to untangle Crow's property records faster than she could. The Bellamy family came back in March. Cal Bellamy was in his 60s with a wife and 2 grown sons, and when he walked his own land again for the first time in 2 years, he didn't say much about it. He walked the fence lines and looked at the barn they'd rebuilt after the fire and stood at the edge of the property where the water ran and stood there a long time. His wife Nora found Vivian in town one afternoon in April and said, without preamble, I heard you were the one who put the case together. I had help, Vivian said, but it was your records that did it. The records were already there, I just organized them. Nora Bellamy looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been around long enough to know when someone is deflecting. You can take the credit, she said. You don't have to apologize for it. Vivian thought about that later. The instinct to step back from the thing she'd done, to distribute it into smaller pieces and hand them out until her own portion seemed modest. She'd been doing it her whole life, in the freight company, in the hotel, in every room where she'd been the only woman with a ledger, making herself seem like less than she was so the people around her would be comfortable with what she could do. She was 36 days past her humiliation on that street in Caldwell. She was 36 days into a life she had built from the pieces of the one that had failed, and the life that was assembling itself around her was not the one she'd planned, but it was more real than the planned one had ever been. She decided she was done apologizing for the arithmetic. The conversation with Graham happened in the study, which felt right. It was an evening in late October, almost exactly a month after the arrests, and the first real snow had come and gone and come back, and the ranch had the particular quality of a place settling into winter. Quieter, more contained, the days shorter and the work shaped differently. Clem and Dolph had mostly stopped treating her like a guest somewhere around week 3, and started treating her like someone who was there, which was its own kind of acceptance. Jonah and Elsie had established themselves in the rhythms of the place, Elsie cautiously and then with increasing confidence, which was more or less how healing works when it's allowed to proceed at its own pace. Vivian was at the desk finishing the corrected accounts, the real ones now, clean and accurate, the version of this ranch's financial history that showed what it actually was rather than what it had been manipulated to appear. It was good work. The ranch was in better shape than it had seemed. The losses from the fraud were significant but not fatal, and there were 3 years of legitimate operation underneath the damage that pointed toward what the place could be. Graham came in and sat in the chair across the desk, the chair where Jonah had sat that early morning and told them everything, and looked at her. She finished the sentence she was writing and looked back. I've been thinking, he said. About what specifically? About the arrangement. He turned his hat in his hands once, which was the only nervous habit she'd identified in him and therefore significant. You came here to work accounts? The work is mostly done. The trial's over. There's no particular reason you'd stay. She looked at him. Except, he said, and then stopped. Except, she agreed. He looked at her with those pale grayish-green eyes. I'm not good at this. I know. I'm not going to pretend I have things to say that I know how to say. You don't need to. Vivian. He said her name like it was something he'd been holding for a while and had decided to set down. I would like you to stay. Not as an employee. He stopped again. Restarted. I would like you to stay as someone who is here because she wants to be here. If you'd consider it. She thought about what she had arrived with, $34 and a pressed dress, and the specific wreckage of a plan that had been made for her by someone who didn't care what happened to her. She thought about the first morning she'd sat in this study and felt something that resembled relief. Here is a problem I know how to solve. She thought about a man walking across a street in Caldwell while everyone else stayed where they were. She thought about what she had now, the work she'd built, the case she'd assembled from nothing. Nora Bellamy telling her to take the credit without apologizing for it. A room with a window and a rug that had been put there by someone who prepared for people before he knew who they were. "I'm not going to be an easy person to be in a life with," she said honestly. "I'm stubborn about things. I have opinions about systems, and I'm right about them more often than is comfortable to live with. I'm not going to defer to someone just because—" "Vivian," he stopped her, not unkindly. "I don't want someone who defers." She looked at him. "I want someone who argues with me when I'm wrong," he said. "I've been wrong a few times, and nobody argued, and the fence posts on the South Line still aren't right because of it." A beat. Among other things, she looked at the desk, then at the corrected accounts, then at him. "The accounts are finished," she said, "as of tonight." "I know. I was going to need something else to do. The Bellamy property needs its books sorted, and the Hennessy place when they get back." He paused. "I thought maybe someone with your particular skill set might find work in this territory for some time." "Someone," she said. "You," he said. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all day had finally committed, and it was coming down in the dark beyond the window in the slow, steady way of a first real winter snowfall. Not a storm, just an arrival. The study lamp made a small, warm circle in the room. This was not the life she had planned. She had planned a house in Caldwell, with curtains that were going to be blue, and a man she had believed in for 6 months, and a future that had seemed solid enough to travel 800 miles toward. What she had instead was a room with a view of the east and a rug that had been put there for her before she existed as a specific person in this place. She had Jonah and Elsie across the hall. She had Clem and Dolph arguing about bread at the kitchen table. She had the accounts of 3 recovering ranches waiting for her attention. She had a man who had walked across a street when nobody else moved and who had given her honest work instead of pity, and who turned his hat in his hands when he was nervous, and who had, she thought, been sitting across from her at kitchen tables and study desks for the past month in the way of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to say so. "All right," she said. He nodded once. She went back to finishing the last entry in the corrected accounts, and he stayed in the chair and they sat in the lamplight in the quiet study while the snow came down outside. And it was not a romantic scene exactly. It was not the kind of thing that gets written up as a moment. It was just 2 people in a room together, which is sometimes the whole of what you need it to be. There's something people don't tell you about starting over. They talk about resilience, about standing back up, about the human capacity to absorb loss and continue. And all of that is real. Vivian would not argue with any of it. She had done all of those things, and she knew what they cost. What they don't tell you is that the life that comes after the wreckage is not a consolation prize. It is not what you get when the real thing fails. Sometimes it is more real than the thing you planned, precisely because you didn't plan it, because it assembled itself from choices made under pressure, from work done when you were tired and frightened and not sure what came next. The things you build when you have nothing left to lose tend to be built from what you actually are rather than who you were trying to be. Vivian had traveled 800 miles to marry a man who saw her as a professional asset and had been careless enough about even that to throw the plan away. She had arrived with $34 and a pressed dress and the specific weight of public humiliation, and she had sat down in a stranger's study in front of a disaster of unorganized records and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the anger, the clean, specific pleasure of a problem she knew how to solve. That had been the thread. That thread had led her here. She thought sometimes about the women who had stayed in that crowd on the street in Caldwell, the ones who had watched and laughed. She did not hate them. She had decided early on that hatred was too expensive for the return it offered, but she thought about them, and she thought about what they had seen when they'd looked at her that day. A woman who'd been made a fool of. A woman who had nothing. A woman who was far from home and alone and carrying a traveling bag with nowhere particular to go. They had not been wrong about any of those facts. What they had been wrong about was what those facts meant. A woman with nothing still has herself. Whatever she knows, whatever she can do, whatever she is capable of when the circumstances require it, that doesn't disappear when everything else does. Vivian had walked away from that street with $34 and 8 years of bookkeeping experience and the bone-deep knowledge of what numbers can reveal when you know how to read them, and that had been enough. Not comfortable. Not easy. Enough. She was not, even now, inclined to wrap this in something prettier than it was. She had been lucky in specific ways. Graham had been at that depot, had been willing to cross that street. August Toll had ridden hard to Cheyenne. Judge Keene had read the file and acted on it. Any of those things could have been different. But luck lands differently depending on what you've built to receive it. The documentation had to be there. The case had to be solid enough that a federal judge could act on it. The satchel had to be convincing enough that Crow believed it until it was too late. Those things had been done by one person with a pen and a desk lamp and the stubbornness to stay in the study until the work was finished. She had done those things. She was allowed to know that. The snow fell outside the study window all evening and through the night, and in the morning it lay deep and white across the ranch from the barn to the far fence line, and the sky above it was the hard, clear blue that follows a Wyoming snowfall. And Vivian stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at all of it. Elsie came out and stood beside her. She'd started doing this, appearing in the mornings, not talking necessarily, just occupying the same space. She was still careful, still watching the world with the eyes of someone who'd learned the hard way that it didn't always offer what it appeared to. But she was here. She had made it here. And she was standing on this porch in the cold, clear morning with her coffee, and that was not a small thing. "It's very white," Elsie said. "It is," Vivian agreed. "Is it like this all winter?" "I don't actually know. This is my first Wyoming winter." Elsie glanced at her sideways. "You seem like you've been here longer than that." Vivian looked at the snow and the sky and the long, clean line of the fence running west. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place, whether it was a matter of time or a matter of what you'd done there, what you'd built and fought for and refused to leave. "Maybe," she said, "that's because I plan to stay." Elsie looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the snow. She didn't say anything else, but she stayed on the porch until her coffee was finished, and then she went back inside, and she left the door open behind her. The specific, small gesture of someone who assumes you'll be coming in when you're ready. Vivian stayed a few minutes longer. The ranch was waking up around her mom. She could hear Clem in the barn, the horses moving, Graham's voice giving some instruction to Jonah about the water trough and the ice. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a working day beginning in a working place. She had arrived at this place with the wreckage of someone else's plan for her life. She was leaving the porch this morning to go into the study and open the Bellamy accounts and continue the work of rebuilding something real from what had been taken. This afternoon, she would argue with Graham about the supply ordering system, which she had thoughts about, and she would be right, and he would know she was right, and they would stand in the kitchen disagreeing about it with the comfortable friction of people who have stopped pretending to agree about things they don't agree about. Tomorrow, there would be other work. And the day after that. The life you build from nothing is built one day at a time, in the specific details of it, in the coffee and the cold air and the open door and the accounts waiting on the desk. It is not built in a single moment of triumph or a single dramatic turning point. It is built in the accumulation of ordinary days that you chose to show up for. Vivian finished her coffee. She went inside. The door closed behind her with the quiet sound of something settled, something that knew where it was, something that had found its place not by arriving at a destination, but by doing the work until the work became home.